Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's event, Frontline Funds, Investing in Grassroots-led Responses to Climate Change. This online event is part of London Climate Action Week. I hope you're all feeling relaxed and ready for a really exciting conversation today. We have a fantastic panel lined up, and I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. So thanks to all our audience for joining this space today. My name is Georgina, and I'm Digital Officer at IIED, and I'll be providing technical support during this session today. We have been able to host today's event with the support of several partner organizations, and we will have the opportunity to hear from some of them and about the fantastic work they do. They are the HighLevel Commission, Slum Dwellers International, Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and Global Resilience Partnership. And well, that's it from me. I am now absolutely delighted to introduce Andrew Norton, Director of IIED, who will give some welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Georgina, and welcome to everyone. Yeah, it's my privilege to introduce this event and to welcome you all to this event, Frontline Funds, Investing in Grassroots-led Responses to Climate Change, as part of London Climate Action Week. Welcome on behalf of IIED, my organisation, and our partners, as were outlined by Georgina at the beginning. What do we want to get from this event? Well, we're looking to illustrate Frontline Funds as vital and effective mechanisms to build resilience at the local level to multiple risks, including climate change, rooted in legitimate decision-making processes and inclusive of all actors. We also want to look at the ways in which donors and development actors can work in partnership with grassroots organisations and social movements to accelerate local action for climate resilience and adaptation, and to get money where it matters to the front lines of the climate crisis. So why is this so important, this agenda? Well, we need multiple channels to drive resources that support locally led adaptation action. We need to be able to reach a range of key actors at the local level, including communities, different communities, including local government and the local level private sector as well. Now, where states and public institutions can engage to support that kind of action in inclusive ways, that's great. But we also know that there are instances where that's not the case. And we also know that in any context, we will benefit enormously from having multiple channels for reaching local civil society. And it's important to have that diversity. Diversity in this context and in this sector will be strength. We're looking at challenges of overlapping exclusion and forms of disadvantage, intersectional disadvantage, and reaching all communities is something you can never take for granted and is something we all need to be constantly self-critical about and aware of. It will be vitally important to be working with institutions that are committed to social and environmental justice in this context, and that can provide the right kind of support. And this applies all the way down, if you like, the finance supply chain, from the donors or the finance end, all the way through to reaching the local level communities and others at the front line of the climate crisis. Without the right norms and values throughout that supply chain, things won't work in the right way, and we won't reach all of the groups that will need to be reached in the context of the accelerating climate crisis. That's all I wanted to say at this point. So let me now introduce a video from Nigel Topping, who's sorry he couldn't be with us today. He is the UK high-level champion for climate action for COP26, someone who's very committed to supporting local level action and has interpreted the brief of the champion, which is about non-state actors, in a way that really emphasizes the importance of reaching excluded communities with support to deal with and to engage in their own climate action, build their own resilience, and deal with the various challenges of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy, for your kind introduction, and hello everyone who's joined us today from all around the world. I'm delighted to be here to kick off this conversation with you all as part of London Climate Action Week. Today we are 126 days out from the start of COP26 in Glasgow. And for this to be a truly impactful COP, we know that we need to place adaptation and resilience on a par with climate mitigation. But more importantly, and in line with this week's theme of resilient recovery, we need to accelerate locally led action on climate resilience and adaptation, ensuring that money flows to where it matters most. We simply cannot let this once in a lifetime opportunity pass without addressing the clear asymmetries between the communities who are already dealing with the consequences of climate change and the lack of finance to locally identified solutions. Put simply, if we really want to tackle the climate crisis, we have to mobilize even more state and non-state actor finance to adaptation and resilience and get it to community organizations who are the ultimate agents of change. That's why I'm so happy that we are here today to discuss exactly that by drawing attention to the Frontline Funds Accelerator. In my role as the high-level champion for COP26, I've participated in regional and global dialogues on climate change and heard the same story from frontline communities around the world. They are already taking action and not waiting for help helplessly. And it's one of the reasons why we launched the Race to Resilience in January of this year, to mobilise more non-state actors towards adaptation and resilience, and to drive more resources towards those organisations who are delivering locally led adaptation already, helping making vulnerable communities more resilient to climate change. We already have 21 partner initiatives taking action around the world as part of the Race to Resilience. And importantly, they're connecting non-state actors with local leaders to ensure that work is led by local knowledge. It was at the same summit in January where we launched the Race to Resilience that we heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres call for 50% of total climate finance to be allocated to adaptation and resilience. And we know that investing in adaptation and resilience is not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. The cost-benefit value is very well established. But we also know that these investments will only have a transformative impact if they are long-term commitments, created in partnership with local actors and taking into account the future risks from climate change. So I'm really pleased to see the IIED once again taking the lead on driving the conversation on locally led adaptation, together with colleagues from SDI, the Huayru Commission, CJRF and GRP, and lifting up the examples of innovative best practice that can be scaled to deliver community resilience to climate change. One of the most effective catalyzers of action that we will have at this COP and beyond is storytelling and knowledge sharing. It sounds too simple to be true, but it really counts when it comes to focusing minds and informing decision making. We need to demonstrate the transformative power of locally led adaptation and resilience and offer clear points of entry for state and non-state actors to support it. I'm delighted then that today we are hearing from grassroots organisations who can share what is working and what is not working from the context of the work they're doing on the ground. It's this knowledge sharing that will help drive the increase in understanding that we need on locally led adaptation, but also the step change in ambition and action that is needed to deliver resilience for frontline communities. In the run-up to COP26, we'll be utilising the Race to Resilience to amplify these stories and to share these best practice case studies, mobilising even more resources towards locally led initiatives. Please do reach out to me on what we can do together. We'd love to have more of you involved in the Race to Resilience and to support your COP26 plans. Andy, thank you once again for having me and for the amazing work that IIED is doing together with a fantastic group of partners on the Frontline Funds. Let me hand back over to you now, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And we've heard from Nigel, that's very good welcoming remarks and comments. So going forward, we have our session is in two parts. We have the first part where we'll hear from the grassroots, illustrating frontline funds and articulating the need for scaling up. And then the second part, we have donors and development organizations, reflecting on the value of grassroots-led financial mechanisms by addressing some questions. And by introduction, I'm Tracy Kajumba. I work with the International Institute for Environment and Development as a principal researcher in the climate change group, and happy to have all of you here. So our speakers for the first part, I'll invite Sarah Nandudu, who is the National Coordinator of the National Slum Dwellers Federation of Uganda, to share with us experiences of the Frontline Funds and what they are doing at the grassroots level. Sarah, you have 8 minutes, and welcome to address our listeners.
Thank you, Tracy. My name has already been mentioned. I'm Sarah, the coordinator of the National Slum Dwellers Federation of Uganda, and we are affiliated to Slum Dwellers International. 8 minutes, I'll try to space what I have, but all I can say is that our process is basically a movement of the urban poor, and the overall objective is for us to come together as a team, try to forge ways of how we can survive even in this era where you do not have services in slum areas or informal areas. And worst of it all is livelihood as one of the key issues that we marvel with. And so this makes us to come together as a group to mobilize ourselves to be able to come out of this by sorting out solutions for ourselves as we seek interventions from other partners like government and other agencies. So in relation to the topic of discussion today, as a movement, our core message is mobilizing communities into saving groups. And saving groups meaning saving resources like money. And you don't only save resources like money, but we also save or collect data to inform the discussions around development in our settlements. And these are community data through profiles, enumerations, and mapping. Frontline Funds. As a network, we build on what we call an urban poor fund, a fund that we all as a network of SDI have in all our countries. And the essence behind this is to give capacity to the urban poor to do a little meaningful things that they're able to do. Such things like improving household, maybe attainance of security of tenure to avert evictions, support communities into livelihood through community upgrading resources and community upgrading funds. So basically, the message behind Frontline Funds is to empower communities financially to answer to most of the challenges that we go through. And I would say that for our case, our resources have been able to support our own process by putting together interventions like making wealth out of waste, where Kampala capital city is one of the cities which is flooding when it rains. So we have taken it as an opportunity. Most communities that we are mobilized have decided to use the waste that blocks these channels in the city to collect that waste and make wealth out of it. So a number of our groups have been able to turn waste into wealth, because instead of waiting for the government to come in and block drainages, the effect it is also feel it. And so our groups have been able to come up with such a solution, and also making biodegradable materials to make charcoal instead of burning trees, molding what we call briquettes to use for cooking. And this has supported our communities into livelihood. And to make it better, we use our frontline resources or funds to support such groups to be able to buy machines like molding machines for briquettes, like molding machines for the plastic bottles that can be molded for sale, and then putting innovations like making shoes, creating job opportunities for the youth and the vulnerable women and men. And then above all, skilling them into livelihood interventions that are able to support incomes in the families and at individual level. For this has been so successful because of the model of collecting people together in groups, a methodology that we have effectively used to mobilize the urban poor, the National Slumless Federation of Uganda, to come up with a process that have a voice to speak and deliberate on issues in different municipalities, in different agencies, and support from other partners. So the role that we have spearheaded is to help support in building capacity of the marginalized communities, as well as forge a way to create partnership, meaningful partnership that can support the growth and scale up the interventions. So majorly the key areas of intervention in terms of scaling up is how do we support these communities that have already initiated these interventions to go to scale? Because like I said, for example, our urban poor fund, which would call a frontline funds that we use as of now, is so limited that we can't go to scale. The little we can do is to do things like precedent setting projects, of which when we do a precedent setting project, we expect agencies like governments to join hands with us to scale up, or else make sure that we get other people to support and hold our hands to support our process so that we go to scale. I want to know that when I see that picture, I know that I'm about to close, 1 minute to close. So basically what we are looking at is that we want to see how we scale up these interventions by joining hands with different partners who can come and support these initiatives that we've already driven, that we've already started, and that we want to take to scale so that the effects of climate change are averted in our communities. Remember, these slum settlements are so huge, and our interventions may take like 5 to 10%, but the remaining areas are left without anyone to support. So once we join hands with other agencies, we are able to scale up and go to at scale, maybe reach even 80, which would be really good for us. Thank you very much, Tracy. I'll have time to respond to questions if there are any. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share a little that I have been able to share. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And in that short speech, there are so many issues coming up. Communities as solution holders, innovation, mobilizing funds, collecting data, responding to disasters, having their voice in planning, and partnerships, which is already really a lot. There's something to build on. We're not starting from scratch. So next, I'd like to introduce Godover Dange, who is the president of the Saki Women's Federation, Osmanabad district of Maharashtra in India. She's a grassroots leader of Swayam Shikshan Prayog and a member of HighLevel Commission. Unfortunately, the speaker was not able to be with us, but we have a recorded speech which we'll listen to.
मेरा नाम गोदावरी है। मैं फेडरेशन की सेक्रेटरी हूँ, HighLevel कमीशन की मेंबर हूँ। हमारे फेडरेशन में 7000 महिला मेंबर है। हमारा जो CRF फंड है, तो ये फंड जैसा कि आपत्ति के बाद महिलाओं को जो दिक्कत आती है, तो ये दिक्कत में काम करने के लिए हम हमारा CRF फंड यूज करते हैं। जो CRF फंड है, ये फंड लेके ड्रिप करना है, जो वेल है कि वेल का रिचार्ज करना है, और जो जिसके पास कंपनी है, तो कंपनी में हम कैसा सब्जी लेके वो उनका फैमिली का पूरा मैनेजमेंट करना है। तो ये इसके लिए हम हमारे महिलाओं को फंड देते हैं। और हम जो ये CRF फंड है, तो पूरा महिला ही मैनेज करते हैं कि हमारे फेडरेशन के महिला है। हम ज्यादा इतना नहीं ये करते कि जैसा बैंक है, फाइनेंस है, उधर बहुत सारे डॉक्यूमेंट लेना पड़ता है, बहुत बार जाना पड़ता है। तो हम हमारे महिलाओं को कितना सहज वो पैसा मिलना चाहिए, तो ये हम पहले उनको अवेयरनेस करते हैं। उसके बाद एप्लीकेशन लेते हैं। एप्लीकेशन आने के बाद फेडरेशन वो चेक करता है एप्लीकेशन, और उसके बाद हम हमारे फंड मैनेजमेंट कमेटी में हम उनको जो निधि देना है, कितना देना है, कौन से चीज के लिए देना है, कितने टाइम के लिए देना है, उनके साथ हम महिलाओं के साथ डिस्कशन करते हैं और उनको ये पैसा दे देते हैं। महाराष्ट्र में जो आपत्ति है कि जैसा ड्राउट है, ड्राउट 2012 से 15 तक बहुत बड़ा ड्राउट था, इसलिए हमने एक स्टडी किया था कि सर्वे किया था, और सर्वे में ऐसा निकल के आया था कि जैसा महिलाओं को खाने के लिए अच्छा नहीं मिल रहे, और पूरा फैमिली के लोगों को भी, जैसा बच्चे हैं उनको भी खाने के लिए नहीं मिल रहे। तो महिलाओं ने क्या किया है कि हम उनका ट्रेनिंग भी दिया है कि कितने कम पानी, कम टाइम में वो सब्जी लेके, ये तो उनका पूरा फैमिली में भी वो सब्जी जब खाते हैं तो उनका न्यूट्रिशन भी बहुत अच्छे से होता है। उसके साथ हमने जो न्यूट्रिशन का जो 1 एकड़ मॉडल भी किया था उसमें, कि कम से कम 25 टाइप के सब्जियां उन महिलाओं ने लिया था। तो ये लेने के लिए दो उसमें फायदे हो गए कि एक तो उनके घर में खाने के लिए तो मिला, और उनका पैसा भी बचत हो गई उस टाइम में। अच्छा न्यूट्रिशन का जो भी ऑर्गेनिक सब्जी महिलाओं ने लेके हेल्थ भी, बीमार भी नहीं पड़े। महिलाओं ने उनके गांव में भी बेच दिया, तो बेचने के बाद महिलाओं के हाथ में पैसा दिया है। तो सब महिलाओं ने उनके घर के सामने किचन गार्डन लगाया, तो उसका क्या हो गया कि तुरंत उनके खाने के लिए पैसा मिला, सब्जी मिला। हमारा जो फेडरेशन है कि जैसा उस्मानाबाद डिस्ट्रिक्ट में 2 फेडरेशन है, तो 2 फेडरेशन से हम उस्मानाबाद डिस्ट्रिक्ट में पूरा तो अभी तक कि 1.5 कोटी तक हमने फंड दिया है, और 5000 महिलाओं को हमने फंड दिया है। और जो भी एसएसपी का पूरा डिस्ट्रिक्ट, अलग अलग डिस्ट्रिक्ट है कि 50,000 महिलाओं को 4 कोटी तक हमने फंड दिया है।
Thank you, Godover, for that intervention. Still the same messages of a lot of work on food and nutrition, still collecting community funding, agriculture interventions. Actually, Godover is here with us. So if you have questions, you might drop them in the chat box and maybe get responses if you have comments on that. So our next speaker then is Nassim Sheikh, who is a grassroots leader of Swayam Shikshan Prayog, and also a member of HighLevel Commission. So Nassim, you're welcome. You have 8 minutes to share your interventions.
Thank you. My name is Nassim, and from India, SSP India, and SSP is a founder member of HighLevel Commission. HighLevel Commission, a global social movement of grassroots organization in 40 countries. As Godavari shared about all our intervention around the resilience fund and the to address drought and earthquake, basically SSP started our work in 1993. First time 700 women organized in earthquake recovery and reconstruction time as a social engineer to facilitate reconstruction between community and government, because government is facing a lot of challenges for the construction and they are not able to convince community for the construction. So these women as a social engineer, they took role for facilitation between community and government, and we are able to construct more than 200,000 houses in 4 years with the help of these organized 700 social engineers. The same women organized into the self-help network, and our network till now, today, we are 500,000 women in our network. As Godavari mentioned, our region, especially we are from Marathwada region of Maharashtra state, where we are facing series of drought, and women face lot of challenges around food, powder, and water. So, and our all agriculture economies depend on the agriculture. So, with the help of Vairo Commission and Swayam Shikshan Prayog, we jointly established community resilience fund, which is owned and managed by the community to address climate risk and find out new adaptive innovative solutions for food security, income security, water security, as well as the to reduce the vulnerability among their communities. So these basically, like when I say about women are the manager of this fund, they are the designer of this fund. They keep 4-5 things in mind when they design this fund. They see what are the risks they are facing through the mapping process, and they identify that risk, and they try to find out adaptive solutions, and then according that basis, as well as we find out the opportunities also to convince government through this fund, whatever the work women are doing, we are trying to use that solutions as a evidence to talk or to make convince our local government to invest certain funds in that. So we are following when we are when we design the community fund, we follow 3-4 areas. One is risk vulnerable needs assessing the vulnerabilities, addressing the needs of community, addressing the climate risk, and potential and opportunities or potential areas where we can work with the local government. So these are the elements we see. And when we are why this fund is very much important for the grassroots women, from my perspective, because when these women goes to bank or any uh, financial institute, they ask certain guarantee collateral, and they will not provide any money because these women are not having experience to run the business and all. So this fund is very important fund, and other side government is providing small subsidies which will not be sufficient. Small or one time subsidies are not sufficient to make to create a resilience community or resilience family. So this fund is very much important for us as a grassroots women and grassroots women's organization. If women gets the money, they can design and plan and use and reuse again and again till the communities or the families become resilient to bear the shock. And I want to especially mention here about our experience during the COVID. Those women who helped through this resilience fund, and they are able to secure their food, their livelihood during the COVID, they started helping to other migrants and the vulnerable communities in their villages and community for their food security. So if we want to build resilience community, the financial mechanisms has to be created, and that should be given into the grassroots women's organization, and they will de- design according their context, and they can design and utilize according their context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nassim. And we see a lot of the power of women, of organized groups, and what they're able to do, again, in what Nassim has shared. So our last speaker in the first part of this session is Ali Ibrahim. He's an independent financial consultant, and he consults around financial and transaction advisory issues. And he did a piece for the Global Resilience Partnership, who are members of the Frontline Funds, looking at the voices from the frontline, especially during the COVID pandemic, stories that look at community-based responses to COVID-19, which also brought out issues of finance as major in that. So Ali, you're welcome to share your findings.
Good day, everybody. I'm just going to pull up the slides. Yeah, so I'm representing Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN. The Voices of the Frontline was actually a project that was aimed at telling the stories of frontline communities as responses to the COVID crisis. What I'm going to be talking about relates really to the finance component of these stories. How did the communities access finance and what challenges they were facing? So I'll be talking through that. So just by way of an introduction, the Voice of the Frontline is a collaboration between CDKN, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, IIED, and the Global Resilience Partnership. And as I mentioned, it was aimed at sharing lessons from grassroots communities' response to COVID-19 with the hope that it would strengthen future resilience building at the community level. In total, there was 45 stories that were written by NGOs, the CBOs, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Pacific. And these are published on the CDKN and IIED websites, and also shared by GRP through different media. Finance and access to finance was cited as a major challenge and barrier during many of the stories. And a subsequent piece of work which I led was looking at what the financing approaches were that were used within the COVID interventions that were mentioned in the stories, and also to look at what the barriers were that people mentioned during these stories. And just to mention very quickly what the methodology was, essentially a desk-based review of the 45 stories, as well as interviews with selected participants and from among the stories. Not all the stories necessarily led to an interview. So I'm just going to speak very quickly on some of the major or key barriers that were mentioned in terms of barriers to accessing financing at the community level. I've split up into 4 categories. The first is economic or financial. In many instances, a lack of adequate collateral was mentioned as a significant barrier. Also the fact that, and I must just mention that most of these stories the context is that it relates to informal settlements, slums, poor communities. So just bear that in mind when I go through this list of barriers. Usually communities or individuals within communities, they lack the formal borrowing track record that typical traditional financiers look for. Also, many times the people who earn income within these poor communities don't have a stable or dependable source of income. They don't earn a monthly salary that is regular in that way. And that is seen as a huge risk for traditional financiers. And so they stay away from providing finance to individuals from these poor communities. From a regulatory and governance perspective, informal settlements lack the status and rights that formal settlements are offered. And how does this prevent access to finance? If you look at public finance from government sources, for example, informal settlements don't have the institutionalized structures that are available within formal settlements, and so there's this lack of access to this public funds in many cases. Also, lots of the community members within the poor settlements don't have formal documentations or evidence of security of tenure in terms of property, and so this is also seen as a big barrier to accessing finance. From a donor funding perspective, donor funding processes and conditions were cited as lengthy, burdensome, and inflexible. And related to that, also, interviewees mentioned that often the objectives of donor funders are not always well aligned with the actual needs of communities. Yeah, so on the market front, these are not new things, but the cost of traditional finance is prohibitively expensive. There's a danger that poor communities find themselves in a debt trap. Also, when we talk about finance here, we're talking at the micro scale. These communities cannot borrow large amounts of money, so we're talking about small loans, small financing, which is often that doesn't make sense for traditional financiers in terms of the cost of having to provide such funding. And also, even though social and environmental considerations are becoming more important, traditional financiers still place financial returns high on their priority list, which also creates a problem for accessing finance. And on a social level, lack of financial literacy was cited as a barrier because entrepreneurs from these communities find it difficult to understand what is involved when they approach traditional loan financiers, and so they would shy away from that kind of financing. Language barriers was also cited as a challenge, with entrepreneurs not being able to explain or portray the value proposition of the project to potential funders. Gender discrimination was also cited as a barrier. Often in many of the communities coming from the Voice of the Frontline stories, women find a challenge because they typically don't own the land or have access to ownership of capital assets that could be used as collateral for loan financing. Corruption was also cited as another major problem, where public funds or donor funding don't always reach the communities, and there's obviously corruption at levels within that value, within the distribution chain. And lastly, just a general comment on traditional finance modalities, that they are impersonal and don't invest enough time in understanding the local community. And so it's non-participatory approach, which does lead to a barrier to accessing finance. I'm just quickly going to go into, so having looked at the 45 stories and interviewed selected individuals from the stories, 4 examples of financing approaches that sought to respond to these barriers are highlighted here on the slide. And the first one, which Sarah also mentioned, was community savings groups. Now, these are participatory savings approach where it's built on strong relationships and trust between group members, where they also hold each other accountable. I'll try to add a little bit more to that, but I'm just going to run through the 4. The second one is a profit-sharing microfinance model that was emerged from one of the stories from the Gambia. The Treasure Woman Warrior group use that particular profit sharing mechanism. It is very similar to the community savings group, although they don't charge interest, but they work on a profit share model. The third example of a financing approach was the crowdfunding, and the specific example relates to Mozambique project, the Voices of the Frontline project in Mozambique, where Kiva loans were used to support agriculture projects and different interventions within the agriculture value chain. The fourth example of a financing approach is a little bit of it's not a standard financing approach, but it's also emerged from a Cape Town-based story where Abelimi Bezikaya was an NGO providing training to urban farmers in terms of building livelihoods from agriculture. And their model is an indirect financing mechanism where they provide services and inputs to communities through subsidized cost or below market-based pricing. Now, just on the matter of the community savings groups, I'm just going to touch on that again, is that it's really a revolving finance principle where groups of 8 or 10 women would typically save every day or month, and they would pool their money and decide on a particular intervention to fund a particular intervention. It's a very flexible way of providing finance. And during the COVID crisis, for instance, where a certain group might have saved money for a particular intervention, they were able to adapt very quickly, understanding that there was issues around food security, and they would be able to change the application of that funds to see to the immediate need. Also, one of the other benefits of the community savings groups is that it really provides a safety net and a form of a social solidarity during crisis events. And these community savings groups really assist in addressing barriers such as the high cost of traditional finance, significant collateral requirements, and as I mentioned, it is quite flexible, and so it can adapt to the needs of communities during crisis events. And just quickly on the profit share model, it was a very similar model to the sharing scheme, except that while the community or the group sharing schemes work on low interest or no interest, the profit sharing model is based on groups of women who also provide loans to each other, but they don't charge an interest. They are required to share 50% of the profit that they generate from the loans and plow it back into the revolving fund, which can then be provided as new loans to new groups. They also work on the principle of paying it forward. In other words, groups, before they are provided with loans, they are provided with training on financial and business literacy, technical skills, technology adoption, and mentorship, so that when money is not just disbursed to anybody, they are taught how to use money, and they are also required to invest into new groups and train new groups of women to uplift themselves economically. Again, this particular financing approach also addresses issues of the high cost of finance, the significant collateral, but also it also addresses the issue of the lack of empowerment of women to pursue economic freedom in a lot of communities, because it's very much a women's based microfinance model. And then just very quickly, the Kiva loans is one where that crowdfunding loans is one that emerged from Mozambique. It was focused primarily on agriculture sector and the entire agricultural value chain. Again, it was a partnership with IIED Global and Kiva, who's the crowdfunding platform. And here also the borrowers who are stakeholders from within the agriculture value chain, they are provided with extensive training and a vetting process before loans are made accessible to them. But once a project is identified as a viable project, anybody from around the globe can actually invest in the project through a loan. It's interest-free, and the borrower will then pay that back over several months, and that money can be reinvested again. And it was found that typically an investor who has an interest in supporting local projects reinvests their funds 11 times before exiting the crowdfunding vehicle. Yeah, and again, the barriers that this particular model tries to address is the high cost of funding once again, but also particularly from within the agricultural sector, given that incomes can be quite variable due to seasonality and climate events, the this particular finance approach assists in helping entrepreneurs who don't have a stable or regular, dependable income, for example. Yeah, and then Abalemi harvest, Abalemi subsidy model. I just want to quickly mention the indirect funding platform now. Abalemi is an NGO that supports urban farmers and in poor communities. And one of the features of their approach is that they provide access to agricultural inputs and training at a subsidized cost. And they also assisted communities to access markets by aggregating all the produce from different farmers and then purchasing that from farmers and paying them, and also offsetting the input cost against that project that they purchase. So in a way, farmers avoid the high cost of inputs to farming, and they get sort of several months of credit, if I could put it that way, because Abalemi is able to provide that inputs to them without them having to actually pay for it upfront. So that's just a sort of interesting and innovative way of financing indirectly these urban farmers. And then just lastly, I want to just move on to high-level suggestions for how finance modalities can be adapted. What has come through from these Voices of the Frontline stories very clearly is that communities, poor communities, they want to be involved in the major decisions involving their own upliftment. And it is important for investors and funders to invest more in understanding the needs, aspirations, capabilities, and resources within these communities, both physical, social, human, and financial. Because through a process of better understanding these communities and the potential borrowers, you are able to better understand the risks of investing in these projects and the potential impacts that these projects may have. And also finance should be used to empower these local communities to build their own resilience and to contribute to their own economic upliftment. A lot of these mechanisms that I mentioned operate on quite a small scale, microfinance. So donor funders and private sector investors should look at co-funding these microfinance vehicles so that the scale can be expanded and based on need-driven interventions. Also, it mentioned that people often said that they don't just need the finance, because they need finance coupled with appropriate capacity building so that they know how to manage funds, how to manage their businesses, and how to grow. Collaboration and coordination with government programs is also essential. This will provide, in order to access finance and to open up opportunities for small business. Donors should also consider aggregating smaller projects or co-fund large projects to create the scale instead of operating in silos. And just from a private sector perspective, private sector finance is not the only important thing. The private sector has a lot more to offer. They should leverage their skills and resources to incubate entrepreneurs and small, micro, and medium enterprises through capacity building, through access to business infrastructure and resources, and facilitate access to markets and expansion to new markets. Thank you. I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ali, for that intervention. A lot of information in there between the challenges and what communities are doing, the recommendations. I won't go through that again. We had a question that wanted to know how the frontline funds are replenished. I think that's the only question that we could tackle. But if there are any comments about that from all the speakers, please do put the answers in the chat box in the interest of time. I would request that we go to the second part of our session today. And I request the next group of panelists to put on your videos, please. And then, as I mentioned before, this is from the donors or development organizations, sort of have a reflection on how frontline funds or mechanisms are working, especially grassroots-led financial mechanisms. And I will introduce our panel today. We have Sinead Walsh, who is the Deputy Director General for the Department of Foreign Affairs, Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs, and a climate envoy. And our second panelist is Edel Monteiro, who is a program lead for the India Climate Collaborative. And this work is a network that works in India and with international donors and foundations to increase funding for effective climate solutions. And the third is Courtney Cabot-Benton, who is an international development economist and a founder of the Share Trust organization, supporting and strengthening women's self-help organizations. So if you can put on your videos then, and so I'll start with Sinead. Sinead, we are very happy to host you today. And we know that Ireland is one of the progressive donors. Your policy for international development focuses on gender equality. We've had lots of struggles and efforts and innovation that women are putting into grassroots-led mechanisms. You also focus on governance as a key priority, lots of governance issues coming up as well, and climate action as well, definitely. And we know that most of the time, the donors really don't want to deal with smaller organizations. We've had all these small organizations that most times don't have the capacity to have everything in place that is required by the donors. So from your perspective, how can donor funding mechanisms prioritize funding streams that place resources in the hands of non-state and non-multilateral organizations that are the front line of addressing climate and development challenges, just as the ones we've had speaking to us today?
Thanks, Tracy, and happy to be with everybody today and to be learning from the examples that have come out already. As you said, Tracy, I mean, this is you know, this is sort of quite an appropriate maybe session for us in IrishAid. We prioritize very much, you know, the furthest behind first is kind of core to what we do, and so we're very you know, always very keen to see how can we kind of get closer down to the local level. I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me today, having spent, you know, the last 20 years in the development sector, mostly in Africa and in South Asia, and half of that with NGOs myself, is that a lot of what's being talked about today, we can put it under a climate lens, but it's basically the same. These are the same challenges that we've all been dealing with, you know, for decades, maybe more under the, you know, sort of terminology around development. As it happens, my own PhD is on the topic, maybe of quite a bit of relevance to today's session, on the balancing act between downward accountability to communities and sort of upward accountability to donors, and is actually Tracy and Sarah is actually based in Uganda. So I looked over quite a number of years at the challenges that, you know, organizations have, and coming back to some of what Sarah mentioned in the beginning, and also Ali was just talking about how to scale up, you know, good community level work, because for IrishAid, you know, the weather question is not really that much of an issue. I mean, we believe in getting financing down to the local level. We've signed up to the local level adaptation principles. As far as I know, it may only be Ireland and the UK so far, so it would really be good to get other governments on board. But you know, we believe in local ownership. You know, we believe in the importance of community decision making. You know, kind of driving these projects. But I won't sort of, you know, oversimplify the matter. It's not easy. You know, we've been trying to do this for many years, and actually my study, my own PhD showed how complicated that is, because almost by definition, once you start scaling up, you know, very kind of organic local level activities. And once you start working with donor funding, and Ali talked a little bit about the challenges there, you know, you really do face some very difficult tensions. And, you know, one thing I would say, Tracy, in relation to the question is, you know, yes, it's good to talk about non-state actors and so on. I mean, we're also interested in state actors. You know, let me put that on the table. We are working with IIED and others on the Life AR initiative, which is is quite an LDC state-led process, and we're facing some of those same tensions and questions around how to how to balance the accountability requirements with this real desire to be much more locally led and locally driven. So I think, you know, we're interested in the state aspect because we think that, you know, we must move away from project-based approaches. We must get, you know, systemic change across society. So there's a role for states in the conversation, but also a really critical role for non-state actors as well. But I think, you know, there is a reality, and, you know, maybe Courtney will say something about this. I don't know. I mean, you know, the funds that we have in Irish Aid, they come from taxpayers. So we have a responsibility to spend that in an accountable manner. And, you know, that's, I suppose, a responsibility that we take very seriously. And I think where we could use maybe a lot more, you know, kind of frank conversation is on those tensions. There's no point pretending that they don't exist. You know, we believe in the intentions of this locally driven work. We would really love to see it scaled up, but, you know, there are real tensions, and how can we work through them together, and how can we be creative? You know, the LDC, the principles for local level adaptation, the Life AR initiative is very much based on this concept of business unusual, and that's great, but almost by definition, it's tricky. So I think we're engaging in this conversation. We don't have all the answers, but we're willing to, I suppose, work with all of you to try to come up with some ways forward. And I think, you know, frankly, acknowledging the tensions, I think, is important, because it's not that, you know, it's not a question of principle. It's not a question of, you know, doubting the quality of a lot of what's being done at local level, but it is a question of how we can report to our taxpayers, to our parliamentarians, and how we can say, yes, you know, we know this money is going where we're telling you it's going. And I think then, you know, the challenge for the local level actors has been well laid out by Ali and others, you know, how to scale up in a way that doesn't lose that local, you know, flavor. So, you know, I think we will continue in these conversations to you know, to work with others to wrestle with these issues. I think we can also, and we also plan to do, you know, to improve our own sort of transparency. And I know transparency is one of the key principles that we talk about here. So, you know, we want to also make sure that what we're doing is available to others, that what we're learning is available to others. And we'd also really like, you know, to be working with other donors and, you know, to have sort of, you know, collective conversations about this. I mean, from the Irish perspective, you know, some of what Nigel mentioned earlier about adaptation funding, I mean, already the vast majority of our climate finance is adaptation. So that's not particularly a problem for us. The issue for us is more underneath that then, what are the quality issues? Where is the adaptation finance actually going? And I think we all know that maybe only 10% is making it to the local level. So what can we really do about that? So I'll maybe leave it there, Tracy. We don't have the answers. We're very interested in listening and learning from models that seem to be working, because we believe very strongly in the objective, but we do need to find a way to resolve the tensions and strike the balances between, you know, the public funding that we have and supporting a scaled up local driven action. So thanks very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sinead. And I think Sinead raises very important issues, the honesty, first of all, to know that it's not straightforward. I think we need that. And the Frontline Funds really, in one of the work plans, we want to engage with the donors to sit down and talk about these issues and find solutions together. Being open to that conversation, I think, is a good way forward. And we have to be honest that nothing is straightforward, definitely. Thank you so much for that. So Edel, I'll come back to you. I know that ICC works on increasing funding. So from your experience, how do you facilitate a process of bringing new players to make climate finance commitments? And especially given the challenges that Dr. Sinead has already mentioned.
Thanks, Tracy. I think it's a great question, given that the ICC, as a network of philanthropies at its core, it's one we've been trying to answer ourselves, and we believe grant is actually best placed to build grassroots institutions and capacities, therefore enabling better access to finance and other resources. And I think our approach to moving donors towards grassroots efforts is by recognizing the real and perceived challenges or tensions, as Sinead referred to them. So some of the few that come to mind, the first is this growing momentum of donors looking to do strategic giving. We've noticed frameworks on scale, sustainability, replicability, they've become commonplace. These lenses, unfortunately, when clubbed with quantitative and myopic metrics, they sometimes tend to exclude grassroots efforts from the running. But our take is that grassroots organizing is an essential strategy for long-lasting locally owned solutions, but also that they can build resilience to multiple stressors. So if you invest in a water structure, for example, you will always have a water structure and it will deliver on water and allied impacts. But of course, a mobilized community can provide last mile delivery of relief when a flood strikes, can set up health camps during a pandemic, build local data repositories to plan, aggregate financial needs, and also help inform where and how to deploy that said water structure. Another associated challenge that we recognize is many funders and donors seek to aggregate the impact of their grant making, again, like Sinead mentioned, to report to their community and board, very often in quantitative terms. And here, the key challenge is how we like to approach this is to challenge funders to locate the value of social capital within the larger climate discourse, maybe even redefine what is qualified as impact itself and how it is measured. I think this also requires addressing the false dichotomy between top-down and bottom-up. I would argue that one of the best returns on investment of building community capacities is the ability to have local leaders participate in and inform the much larger expenditures and initiatives, including government schemes, infrastructure investment, etc., which, if you think about it, significantly amplifies the impact of limited capacity grant money invested. Additionally, I think it's important to recognize that government regulations can be restrictive. This is a real challenge. In India, for example, the Foreign Contribution Act limits re-granting of international monies, a would-be effective mechanism to get funds to the grassroots, while the law governing CSR prescribes very input-output project formats. So at the ICC, we are most keen to have domestic private philanthropy own its unique ability to support grassroots efforts. And since this is a new avenue for some, peer-to-peer funder engagement on this we've noticed to be quite effective. To hear other donors champion the mechanism of frontline funding can reassure and inspire. Storytelling is also another simple but effective tool. I think the last challenge that I'll touch upon is limited resources from funders, administrative costs, staff time, lack of understanding of diverse regional contexts, and local power structures. We've noticed that this can be intimidating, especially for those new to climate or community-based funding. And this is where the role of the many brilliant networks, coalitions, and federations is perfectly highlighted. We've heard from some brilliant examples today. And I think their specific value add is to ensure that funding is directed where it will be most impactful. When we look at the other end of the challenge in terms of grassroots orgs accessing and using funding, we've in our internal conversations noticed there can be technical limitations in terms of data, digital tools, and expertise on climate itself. we've done a scoping where we've noticed that some grassroots efforts do climate aligned work, but maybe don't articulate or frame it so, while others don't necessarily have that climate lens, but would benefit from using it, especially to attract the right funding. So I think this is where maybe there's a role for an ecosystem actor like ourselves to invest in some critical capacity building tools and knowledge that bridge some of the gaps between what donors want to fund and what grassroots leaders can actually deliver. An example of that we are supporting is a climate risk atlas for India, which will include a district level assessment that can help inform local adaptation strategies. Lastly, I think it's a good time to leverage ongoing opportunities and momentum. In our current donor networks, there's a lot of strategic planning and refresh to align with the 2030 decade of action. It is at this critical juncture that the focus of frontline funding can be embedded into portfolios. We can also tap into the recognition that grassroots efforts have received for their contribution to pandemic efforts. In addition to national governments and media, donors have been acknowledging the same. We've noticed this, recognizing the importance of local institutions, of flexible funding, of decentralized decision-making, and lastly, the need to disseminate the capacity to solve rather than the solution itself. And our hope is that these expressed interests turn into funding criteria and reframe how donors and funders look at their own role in the climate ecosystem. Happy to stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Edel, for that intervention. I think we are seeing examples of philanthropies that want to be champions, that are willing to take the risk and learn with the organizations, but also that funding alone is not enough. It takes supporting capabilities and accountability and transparency, which is really important. Despite the challenges, we have to find ways around it and see how do we build trust within these organizations. So Courtney, coming to you now. We've been having these conversations for a very long time. This is not the first time. Lots has gone on, studies have been done. So, but how then do we shift the power dynamics in the funding mechanisms? And how do we move from rhetoric to action to get funds to those organizations that are at the front line?
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the other speakers who've already come. What an incredible group of people and thoughts and ideas. So I'm going to echo a fair bit of what Sinead said. For the last year, I have been helping to lead an expert advisory team at FCDO on their global COVID response. Not so much the health side, but the economic lockdown side through humanitarian cash and social protection to really try and help people who are being affected by lockdown. And one of the really interesting pieces that came out of that is that, as we all know, the rhetoric around localization has been amplified significantly this year. And a lot of the sort of narrative around that has highlighted the need of the sort of withdrawal of all of these international teams that has really renewed a focus on local actors. I would take it even deeper than that. One of our biggest concerns through the work at FCDO, as we've been advising across all of these countries, is this really huge scale up in assistance to local communities through cash transfers, through social protection, through health mechanisms, and really no mechanism on the ground for working through local networks to do sensitization, trusted people in communities who can advise where there are GBV risks or other protection risks as a result of lockdown, who can do accountability and transparency. I mean, it's so deep, the need for us to shift the way this system works, because we truly are hamstrung with the way that the system is currently built to be able to do effective response. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I did was to really kind of dig in, why hasn't work around locally led development, adaptation, humanitarian response, why hasn't this happened? And what is still blocking us from moving, because we've made so little progress on this? And very similar to Sinead's comments, what I found, and I've not just been working within FCDO, but working with a range of other bilateral donors, with huge organizations with tons of people who want to see this change, who are equally frustrated. Exactly as Sinead said, this is tough. Like there's some really intractable ways that this system has been built that makes it difficult to do what we're trying to do. When we looked at the overseas development assistance funding portfolio, when you break it down, 5% of ODA comes from private philanthropy, and half of that is Gates, who are diabolical in their own rights in terms of they're just as bad as the bilaterals in terms of their requirements. Which means that the vast majority of local networks, local initiatives, local actors are really dependent upon 2.5% of the funding pot. So one of the things that we sort of realized was if we're going to shift the system, 95% of ODA sits with bilaterals. We have got to change bilateral systems. So the second piece that we looked at was what is specifically blocking this from happening within the bilateral system. And one of the things that really became apparent that it makes this tough is that bilateral donors are not equipped. You know, I sort of said, I can give you 50 incredible local and national organizations tomorrow in Uganda who are doing amazing work, who can meet your compliance requirements. Every bilateral donor has said, we are not equipped to give 50 grants. There has to be some kind of an intermediary mechanism, something that can help to channel those funds. So what we started to look at was coalition or consortium models, and developed a concept for something called the Local Coalition Accelerator, where we're really seeking to work through existing coalitions and consortiums of local networks and actors and really shift. We just have gone through a 6-month, very extensive consultation process with Global South and private philanthropy and bilaterals. And one of the things that came out repeatedly in those consultations is that if we're going to shift the system, it's not just about funding. We need to shift power as the very first point. And if we can start to change the power dynamic, the funding will follow. And I've heard that echo within the bilateral halls that I walk in terms of just the lack of trusted relationships and how much that inhibits the ability to change funding flows. But also process. The last thing we want is to make local actors be going through hoops for bilateral donors. And that also comes back to Sinead's point, which is that there's a lot to navigate around the fact that bilateral donors are at the end of the day accountable to taxpayers and are heavily influenced by what the media says about how they're spending their money. And of course, that's even tougher in the context of COVID. So really thinking through how do we also shift donor processes so that they can be more amenable to networks of local actors who are, as a network, able to operate at scale without eroding their ability to be really close to their communities and working within their communities. So in a snapshot, it's multiple threads that have sort of come together to try and think about how we move from rhetoric to action, really trying to dig in the practicalities of what has stopped this from happening and how do we start to shift that. Obviously, the piece that we're looking at is one very specific piece around shifting bilateral funding. There's loads of incredible work around building capacity and investing in the capacity of local networks, around sort of community philanthropy. There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. We're just addressing one of them, but hope that it'll start to also shift the system.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for that intervention. So there are lots of issues really, the power of working together, the coalitions, but also rethinking how do you address accountability as it comes in from the taxpayers, but also build the trust that these organizations are able to deliver if they have the right support. I think that's important, and I hope the conversation continues between the donors, philanthropies, and the grassroots-led organizations, sort of find solutions together and break the barriers that are hindering progress towards that. So thank you very much. At this moment, I would like to introduce Sheila Patel, who is the founder and director of the Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers, SPAC, which is an NGO that has been working since 1984 to support community organizations of the urban poor in their efforts to access and secure housing and basic amenities in the cities. And it's also the founder of the Slum Dwellers International. And I lovingly call Sheila the intellectual grandmother, very supportive to young people and all institutions. So Sheila, after hearing all these interventions from the grassroots, what they are doing, and also hearing from the donors and development organizations on what they are doing and what the barriers are. So in your view, what is the take today? What are the key messages that can spur action going forward?
Thank you, Tracy. I have been so involved in listening, trying to answer questions, taking notes. I hope I do justice to what you ask me. I want to start with reflecting on what Sinead, Courtney, and Edel said, the supply side. As a person who's doing this for the last 3.5 to 4 decades, I can tell you that one of the biggest challenges that we face with all forms of intermediaries and original donors is there is no continuity of relationship. In most cases, by the time you finish 3 to 5 years of doing something, your officer has changed, the boss has changed, the policy has changed. And so very often the grassroots organizations are actually the history bearers of those processes. And I want to give you 2 examples for that. Courtney talked about FCDO. Around 2000, STI had an amazing opportunity to sit with very senior people within what was DFID then and carve out a very small fund of $10 million that would be given to STI. That is what we call the Cliff Fund. It was routed through an organization called Homeless International, and it partnered our Urban Poor Fund, which Sarah spoke about. So UPFI helped people to take risky new projects. The Cliff Fund then expanded that, and then we negotiated with municipalities to use government funds to do that. So our present leverage ratio of UPFI is that for 18%, it constitutes 18% of our total capital projects. What that tells you is that the journey takes time, but over a period of time, it helps you negotiate and dialogue with state institutions whose duty-bearing obligations require them to spend money. So that also looks at what Sinead was saying. Presently, there are lots of impediments in what our national governments in the South are ready to do. And therefore, I believe that these kinds of resources build capacity, develop systems, produce documentation, and all kinds of things that will allow us to then participate as partners in large projects. And STI has many, many different examples. But in each instance, the champions within these institutions moved and our programs got cut off. And that's a very important thing for providers of money to know, is the history of your own organization's experiences that were short-lived. The second very important thing for me is that everybody talks about deep accountability of poor communities. Nobody talks about how irresponsible global aid itself has been. You take the Green Climate Fund, you take IIED's program of money where it matters. The obligations to fulfill the spending of the money by allowing it to go to the right place, if it doesn't happen, those instruments are wrong, and there isn't enough attention to change those instruments. But the inability of poor communities, their networks, not to do something is always harped upon. So the supply side's problems are considered to be something that has to be done at a very high level, but everybody is very, very concerned about the problems. And nobody actually has acknowledged the amazing risks that poor people take in their survival strategies, the amount of investment and resources they make themselves in the absence of state and national investment in their well-being as it does for the formal or the landed communities. And finally, nobody actually links the value and the impact of not doing something, of not producing resilience, of not addressing disaster before it happens in the cost analysis. I see so many things, interest rates, what is this, what is that? You know, many studies by economists say that if you don't spend $1 today in producing resilience, you will have to spend $8 in the future. This is only the physical cost. You're not talking about the humanitarian costs. And so for us on the grassroots groups that are here, we want to say that social movements are your petri dish. They absorb risks, they produce peer learning, they produce scale, they have the politics to dialogue and negotiate with their municipalities because they can produce solutions, they can produce data, and they can absorb the risks of failure in ways that individual small organizations cannot. And what Godover and Sarah have said is that they have become national players. They have become part of major projects in their countries. And they sit with policymakers to make change happen. So I feel that the whole idea of the Frontline Funds accelerator is to showcase the nascent potential of what has already happened under different nomenclatures. To say that this is not starting from scratch. We have to gather what exists, produce new engagement. Like many of you said, you know, how do we change the architecture of discussion? Why must we always have something that's designed in Washington or Brussels or London? Why? Why can't we do it together? And we have some models where they have been done together. And I think that we have to start there. The last part that I want to talk about is that with every large investment, there has to be a serious learning agenda. And that learning agenda should not only be the inheritance of grassroots movements, but it should be there for the whole chain. So you have all the philanthropic grant makers, the government institutions, the global intermediary organizations like IIED. How do we create a learning network that goes along with the financing process and that we put everybody's risk in one basket? And I think that although it has not been mentioned, the locally led adaptation financing principles are what all of us have collectively put together to begin to create a framework that holds everybody in this institutional hierarchy that is there today accountable for their roles and functions and their deep accountability to each other. Because unless that learning gets ingrained and become institutional, there is going to be a constant relearning, reinventing. We all say don't reinvent the wheel, but we are doing it all the time. And finally, I'm saying finally many times, but finally, development investment and climate-linked action are two sides of the same coin. They are not different. And therefore, you have a development lens and you have a climate lens. And these are both very critical for the 2 billion people who are extremely vulnerable. So thank you for giving me this time, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for your words of wisdom and very key points there. But my critical one is shared risk, because whatever is not happening is because we are worried people won't be accountable, they are not trustworthy. So meaningful partnerships, dialogue, and the learning especially, which is not one street. Learning should be both ways for the donors, philanthropies, for the grassroots organizations and other organizations in that. So thank you so much, Sheila. I want to thank all our panelists and all participants in this session and hope that the conversation will continue. Thank you so much for joining us.